Hello everyone and welcome to every episode of the Fairly Odd Parents Season 2 Reviewed. Before we get started, I just want to plug my Discord server really quickly. If you'd like to join, we talk about cartoons and pretty much anything else. It's linked below. If you want to know my experience with the season, I had seen most of these episodes before, but only a couple of times. Some of them I saw many times, and a few of them I saw for the very first time making this review. So I consider myself relatively fresh. But without further ado, let's get started with the reviews. Episode 8A, Boys in the Band. Vicky holds Chip Skylark hostage in Timmy's house. First of all, I'd like to say that I do enjoy the musical number at the end of this episode. Obviously, it's pretty classic and well known as a major part of the series. It's probably what you remember about the episode if you haven't seen it in a while, although it's not really helped by how forgettable the rest of the episode is. Before I watched this episode for the review, I couldn't even remember anything besides the song. But now that I've seen the episode, I envy the past self that doesn't remember, because I find the characterization in this to just be awful. There isn't a single likable character here. Timmy's making way too big of a deal about his birthday by trying to get someone killed, but then again, can you really blame him for it that much? His own parents forgot his birthday. Obviously, Vicky is unlikable, and not just for her treatment of Timmy in this episode, but also for her treatment of Chip Skylark, which is almost criminal, but for some reason is played for laughs. And while Chip may be the only character that didn't do something awful, I just find him numbingly boring. I can't name a single personality trait from him after multiple viewings. Even for a minor character, that's pretty bad. And of course, the other bad part of the episode is the ending where, surprise, it wasn't really Timmy's birthday at all, which is incredibly forced and I don't buy it, especially coming from Timmy's parents. Guys, I know this is a beloved episode by Fairly Odd Parents fans, but we're starting out Season 2 with a bad episode. Episode 8B, Hex Games. Timmy challenges Vicky to a skate-off where the fate of the skate park is at stake. This episode tells a good story. It's nice to be able to see Timmy as an underdog and be able to achieve his goal. However, this episode has its problems and they keep me from calling it a good episode. First, there are barely any jokes. Sure, the gag with Chester's braces was kind of amusing, although they lead to a plot hole in the falling action of the story. When Vicky tries to blow up the ramp, Chester's braces pop out of his mouth and turn into tracks for Timmy to skate on. If that's a joke, it's conveyed very poorly, because it's an integral part of the resolution of the story. How do they become big enough to connect entire pieces of a skateboarding ramp and still allow people to roll on top of them? We can clearly see that they fit in Chester's mouth, so that doesn't make any sense. I know characters on this show have big teeth, but come on, this is incredibly lazy and just there to fill up space. Secondly, why is Vicky at the skate park in the first place? And why does she all of a sudden care about skateboarding so much? Maybe it's so she can torment Timmy, but we're given no reason as to why Vicky or any other character all of a sudden likes to skate. This episode just starts at the skate park and we're given no further explanation. And it's not like there wasn't enough time, either. There's an entire filler montage of Timmy practicing at these weird locations to prepare for his contest against Vicky. That is completely useless. It's like a gaping black hole in the middle of the story. Another problem I have with this episode is that while the story is told pretty well aside from those things, the fact that Vicky can claim any jurisdiction over the skate park is a premise I can't buy. Does she own the skate park? And if she doesn't, how is she able to kick people out without ever being questioned? This show is a comedy, so I can buy some more outlandish ideas, but that's just something I can't get over not having any closure on. So, after all my complaints, I think the episode is okay. Surprised? Yeah, I didn't really mind those problems that much in the grand scheme of things. We get some nice visuals from Timmy at the skate park, and overall it is a fun atmosphere. And, Brace's plot point notwithstanding, the contest part of the episode was actually pretty entertaining to watch. Overall, this episode has its problems, but none of them are really that bad to hinder my enjoyment of the good parts. Episode 9A, Boy Toy. Timmy becomes toy-sized to play with a toy, and Cosmo and Wanda get stolen. You know, this episode is actually pretty funny. When Cosmo is turned into a doll and is stolen by Tootie, he has some decently funny lines that are supposed to be his action phrases, which is actually pretty clever. Jokes like asking Wanda if she'd met a blowtorch, and when he said he was having a blast, those jokes actually made me laugh. However, this episode is going to get a bad because of how awful the moral is. At the end of the episode, Timmy is made to feel guilty for launching water balloons at Tootie, not because she didn't do anything to him, but because she lives with Vicky. And sure, that might be fine, but it's treated as an excuse for being a stalker, because that's what she is. I don't care how bad your situation is, you can't convince me that stalking someone is justifiable, and in a children's cartoon no less. Why is Timmy treated as the bad guy for defending himself against his stalker? The show even admits that she's creepy. It's not like she has some sort of crush. She is portrayed as an actual real-world stalker that has a Timmy shrine in her room. That's not really funny, and it's especially not a trait that builds sympathy. What on earth were they thinking? And another thing, this episode's plot treads territory we've already seen. It's like a Frankenstein combination of Tiny Timmy and Chin Up from the first season. And it's got even less substance than that because the Crimson Chin's dialogue is just action phrases, meaning Timmy is basically talking to an inanimate object with no sentience. It's unfortunate, but good jokes could not save this episode. Episode 9B, Inspection Detection. Timmy gets accused of shoplifting. The first note I have is that I want to say this episode is really funny. The gags at the beginning with Timmy just happening to have things that were stolen, Cosmo's slideshow, and Francis stuffing things in his pants are all really funny. And to me, that's what makes this episode. The jokes. This episode is the funniest one in a while, and helping that is the story, which is also great. It's really clever to come up with the idea that, yeah, if Timmy wishes for a lot of stuff, sooner or later, people will suspect that it was stolen. I have to give the writers a lot of credit with this episode because of that. They wrote about a topic that most cartoons wouldn't really think about, and most cartoons would use a unique topic as an excuse to be lazy and not do anything with the premise. But this is the first 11-minute episode of the show that feels like an adventure since Power Mad, which is commendable. There are things constantly happening throughout this episode, and it's fun to watch. It has high amounts of comedy. My one gripe with this episode is that the middle section is kind of fast, and the ending does have to drag a little bit to fill out the space. But still, this episode is good, and it uses a really creative concept to its full potential with humor. There's not much more to say than that. Episode 10A, Action-Packed. Timmy's life becomes an action movie. I kinda wish I hadn't compared the last episode to Power Mad because this episode feels like its spiritual successor. At one point, Timmy even says something about Jorgen being mad with power. Comparisons aside, this episode is a masterpiece. Going along with what I said about the last episode, this episode really feels like an adventure. They do a nice job of setting up how boring Timmy's life is and watching this action movie that affects his behavior, so he wishes to be in one. It's a really creative story and it's decently funny as well. Aside from the quote in the highlight, there's the gag of Cosmo saying he likes older women, Timmy's dad reading the newspaper, and there's the "Tell Timmy I said hi" joke. The action movie plotline makes use of and makes fun of many tropes, such as the reverse switch. The episode doesn't just use them and do nothing with them, there's actually effort put into making a quality product. The story is constantly moving, it's paced well, the comedy's there. It's cliche to say, but this is an action-packed episode. When you have a story as good as Power Mad and you have comedy better than that episode, of course the result is a good episode. And not just good, classic. Episode 10B, Smarty Pants. Timmy wishes he knew everything. As someone who was on their high school's academic team, I have to say this episode decides to portray that sort of tournament in a weird way. There's kind of two conflicts going on at once, and at the same time there isn't really a conflict at all because of how low the stakes are. So, Timmy wishes he knew everything, which causes him to be a jerk to everyone around him. AJ actually deserves it because he was a jerk at the beginning of the episode, but the episode treats Timmy as if he's in the wrong for some reason. And they tacked on Timmy's conflict with his parents, I guess, to fill space. Because, honestly, it didn't have to be in this episode at all, notwithstanding that. For pure story purposes, I guess it could have been written out of the episode entirely. When Timmy is at the Brainathon, there isn't really any tension because you know it's going to come down to the last question, and you know that because AJ knew everything up to that point, the last question is going to be something only Timmy knows. That scene, which is supposed to be the meat of the episode, is incredibly cliched, and jokes can't really save this episode either. A lot of the stuff that was trying to be funny was either AJ in the beginning or Timmy in the rest of the episode, just knowing everything. There's no variation on that, and it gets incredibly tiresome. With all those problems, it causes the episode to fall on the lower side of okay. In general, it just lacks substance, and some questionable decisions were made. Episode 11A, Superbike. Timmy hurts his father's feelings by not using a bike he made. I'm just gonna come out and say it, this is a bad episode. In the beginning of the episode, we are shown a bike that Mr. Turner made for Timmy that is cheaply made and looks like it could fall apart at any moment. It's clearly shown to not be a safe thing to use, and it certainly can't be used to win a contest. The episode is telling me that Timmy is in the wrong for not wanting to use a poorly made bike in a race, one that is repeatedly shown to not be structurally sound. If someone was trying to get Timmy injured, that's the exact bike they'd try to make. So why is Timmy treated by the writers as wrong for wanting to use the bike he wished for, which is sentient for some reason? Another issue I have is that the bike race isn't even shown in the episode. The bikes just fall apart and Timmy and his dad laugh it off. Wouldn't it have made sense for them to cut out the scene of Timmy riding to Chester's house and instead show him winning the race with the bike his dad made him? All of the previous problems with the moral of the episode could have been erased if they'd done that, and I'm not joking. But sadly, that isn't the end of the list of problems I have with the episode. Something they neglect to mention is inexcusable because they bring it up in the previous episode. When Timmy shows up to his race with the superbike, they should have at least alluded to the bike being destroyed or not being able to accelerate or something because magic can't be used to win a contest. It's why Timmy lost all his knowledge in the last episode, and it should have been brought up here. Here's how the second half of the episode should have gone. Timmy should have shown up to the race with his superbike. When it starts, the superbike is destroyed despite its indestructibility. Maybe they could have explained it away with the power of the rules or something like that. Timmy decides to use the bike his dad made, he wins the race and learns a lesson about family or something like that. That would have solved almost every problem I had with the episode, but in its current form it isn't very good. The quote is apt for how I feel about this episode. Episode 11B, A Mile in My Shoes. Timmy swaps places with Cosmo and Wanda. Of all the Season 2 episodes, this is the one I was most familiar with going into the season review. It was on the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour 2 DVD, which I watched ad nauseum as a kid. That might have tainted my perception of this episode, though. I actually found that to be really boring and cliched. It does exactly what you would expect a role reversal plot to do. Nothing is added and subtracted. Timmy and Cosmo and Wanda think their lives are harder than the other, then they swap and realize that the other has it way worse than they thought, and then they swap back. Not much else happens other than that. It's a shame too, because this type of plot has potential, especially with this kind of show, but they don't do anything with it. Even SpongeBob took risks with this concept in the episode Breath of Fresh Squidward, and even though that episode turned out badly, at least they did more with the concept in this episode. This episode is just incredibly lifeless, and it makes it hard to care about what happens. It hits every beat you'd expect this kind of story to hit, and it's lazy. You want to do a role reversal episode? Do it in a way that I don't know what's going to happen on first viewing. And you may say, well, if you said you watched it ad nauseum, shouldn't you know anyway? Yes, that is true, but I didn't really remember it that well. I'd say I last watched this episode in 2009 at the latest. Definitely long enough to have forgotten it. For lack of anything really good or bad, I have to put this in the okay category. I wish this episode would let me feel something other than wasted potential, but instead that's about the only substance in this episode. Episode 12A, Timvisible. Timmy becomes invisible. Seriously, what'd you expect? Like the role reversal, being invisible is a plotline done on a lot of other shows. Unlike A Mile in My Shoes, though, Timvisible actually does something with it instead of a cookie-cutter plotline with very little substance. I think this episode really works because it puts Timmy in the moral dilemma of wanting to stay invisible to avoid Francis, but wanting to stay visible to get his perfect attendance award. That in and of itself would be enough, since they created a unique plot to fit this framework that they've created. And the episode is decently funny too. My favorite part was Timmy's parents staying in their car the whole time, but there are other decently funny jokes like the kid cross-dressing, Cosmo and Wanda in Spanish class, and others. They're really funny and they add to the overall well-crafted story. Which, to me, makes this a good episode. Fun premise, and there's an actual unique plot to go with it. You don't need much more than that in a Fairly OddParents episode. Episode 12B, That Old Black Magic. Timmy meets the Anti-Fairies. My favorite part of the episode is the scenes with the president, who is obviously supposed to be a parody of George Bush, and might I add, a parody that's done way better than Lil Bush. Unfortunately, the rest of the episode is okay. I had a hard time trying to find a way to summarize this episode's plot, because it really lacks one almost. So, the crux of the plot is that it's Friday the 13th, and so the Anti-Fairies are messing with people, but a mundane solution to that would be to just wait until tomorrow and they'll be gone. Instead, Timmy meets these Anti-Fairies and tries to put them back in captivity. I get what they were going for, but this just isn't the way to fully realize it. Honestly, I found myself bored throughout most of the episode because of the mundane plot and lack of jokes. The location of the amusement park is kind of cool. We don't usually get to see locations outside of Timmy's house or the school, so that was kind of interesting, but location alone can't really save this episode, unfortunately, and even if it could, there are way cooler places for the episode to take place. But I can't really call it bad because it's not like it does anything super heinous. It was just kind of uninteresting to me, and for it being the Anti-Fairy's first appearance, that's kind of sad. Episode 13A, Foulballed. Timmy wishes for Chester to be a better baseball player. My favorite part of the episode was the various opposing teams we see the losers play. A team of giant kids, a team of 3-year-olds, a spoof of the New York Yankees. Unfortunately, that's the only positive thing I have to say about this episode. For a lot of this episode, they use baseball terminology, which isn't really much of a problem if you don't need it to understand what's going on, but the writers unfortunately could not pull that off. I watched this episode a few times, and there are parts of the episode where I have no idea what happened, because baseball terminology wasn't explained. You wouldn't have to explain it if you kept the baseball stuff adjacent to what was actually going on, but if you're going to make it a major part of the story, it's a problem. What makes this even worse is that they do things that clearly make fun of baseball and wouldn't happen in an actual game, such as having Chester jump through a flaming hoop. When knowing baseball is part of being able to enjoy an episode, you can't do things like that. Want to know why? People like me who know nothing about baseball won't be able to tell whether or not they're joking when they use baseball terminology-heavy dialogue. And whether your show is a comedy or not, I should be able to tell what's a joke and what isn't a joke. And beyond all the baseball stuff, the story we get is an incredibly cliched one about friends separating because one friend gets some amount of fame. The baseball stuff just makes that part of the story more confusing, honestly. It's a bad episode. Episode 13B, The Boy Who Would Be Queen. Timmy wishes he could think like a girl, but instead becomes one. This episode is one of the more well-known episodes of the series, which is weird for a show with some of the most outlandish and weird plots this side of Aqua Teen Hunger Force. It's actually quite a mundane plot compared to some of the ones we've had so far on the Fairly OddParents. That said, it's still really good. I like the sort of meta-commentary they do with Cosmo and Wanda on flaws men and women have. For that part of the episode, it would have been lazy for them to just swap and become each other, but instead they become a generic man and a generic woman, which makes up a lot of the comedy in the episode. And as for the Tamantha part of the episode, it's like a better version of A Wish Too Far. We actually see some development of Trixie's character, which is something I was not expecting to see at all. Most of the time we don't really see secondary characters grow in some way, and especially in comedically focused shows, but we get it here, and that's a good thing. She actually has interests that she feels she has to hide because it'll be frowned upon by her supposed friends. Well, it works for a few minutes at least. Yeah, my one gripe about the episode is that Trixie decides to stick to her shallow ways at the end at Timmy's expense. But the argument could be made that it's only the second season, and having Trixie end the episode having changed her ways might ruin any potential for future appearances. Not saying I agree with it, but the argument could be made. Other than that, though, I have no gripes with this episode. Episode 14A, Totally Spaced Out. Mark Chang brings an unconscious Vicky to Yucatania. My favorite part of the episode are the characters Gary and Betty. They're portrayed as these creepy camp counselor types that are basically against anything fun. They're the highlight of the humor for the episode, but that's only by default, because I didn't like much else about this episode's humor. This episode is a sequel to last season's Spaced Out, and judging by what I thought of the first one, this one isn't really different enough for my opinion on it to be very different. I'm not really a fan of Vicky basically being unconscious, or at very least not in her right mind the whole episode, especially when that's basically the joke. They don't really vary it up, and it gets boring very fast. There's not much of a plot either. The characters just wait for things to happen around them and aren't actively doing things, which again makes this episode boring. It's kind of hard for me to really feel something about this episode, or care. So, like its predecessor, it gets an okay. Not much good is done, but not much bad is done either. I guess this episode is likable if you're trying to fall asleep. Episode 14B, The Switch Glitch. Timmy torments a 5-year-old Vicky, causing Cosmo and Wanda to be reassigned to her. And it's another role reversal episode. And it's not done good again. I don't think I've seen an episode that could make the two prominent characters in the story so unlikable in such a short amount of time. In the first part of the episode, Timmy is tormented by Vicky, and then for the next 5 minutes or so, Timmy does the same back to Vicky. But here's the thing. In the first part of the episode, you feel bad enough for Timmy because they make it very clear that he's being tortured in enough ways that revenge is justified. But the episode treats him as wrong because of this. The worst part of this is the age difference. I don't know why they didn't just swap their ages, because having Timmy torment a 5-year-old really makes him look bad, even though he would otherwise have justifiable means. And when Cosmo and Wanda become Vicky's fairy godparents, Vicky gets upset when she finds out she can't use them to kill Timmy. but she still ends up winning in the end anyway. Why would Timmy end up feeling sorry for someone that wanted to kill him? And why does that sympathy still not make him a likable character in this episode? Seriously, I have no idea who they intended for me to root for, but by the end of this episode, I was rooting for the credits. You have a character that wants to torment a 5-year-old, but that 5-year-old wants to kill him. How is that funny or even a good story, and how are either of those characters likable? It's a bad episode. The highlight was the jokes they didn't use more than once, which should really be a given and not a highlight, but they beat that tape recorder joke into the ground to the point where it gets really annoying, and it doesn't do this episode any favors. Episode 15A, Mighty Mom and Dyno Dad. Timmy wishes for his parents to have superpowers. This episode really is a breath of fresh air. While a lot of episodes this season have either excelled at story or comedy, this is one of the few that does a great job at both of them. I think it's really clever to have Timmy wish for his parents to have superpowers because in this case, it's one of those classic wishes that seems like a good idea at first, but has unintended consequences. It's fun to see Timmy's parents with the superpowers as well, as they do manage to keep the gags with them comedic, but also separate it from the story by having the Timmy parts of the episode be more serious. Timmy's parents in general are more comedic characters, so having them be a part of the serious tone probably would have been a mistake. The meat vision gag is a recurring gag that doesn't wear out its welcome, unlike the tape recorder gag from an episode ago. And, in general, Timmy's parents discovering their superpowers and having them go through the typical superhero cliches, such as secret identities, is really what makes this episode. It's good, and I wish this show would use Timmy's parents a lot more. This episode really shows what comedic characters they can be. Episode 15B, Knighty Knight. Timmy wishes to go back to medieval times where his parents are about to get eaten by a dragon. I really like the atmosphere of this episode. Once again, the episodes that succeed this season tend to be very stylized and make fun of the tropes that make up that style. You get your jokes poking fun at Arthurian tales and medieval England, and they are really funny. Arthur Leibowitz seemingly not knowing the tropes is also a nice addition and really helps this episode excel at humor. The problem is, all the success at humor comes with a half-baked story. At first you think the episode is going to be some kind of adventure or quest that Timmy goes on to save his parents, but we have to go back and forth between that and the Timmy part of the story and throwing Arthur in that part of the story. What you get in the end is already cluttered enough, but it's bookended by the setup of the Renaissance Fair and the ending of Timmy reading this book to his parents. That really means it doesn't feel like a plot has happened because you're trying to juggle all these moving parts that don't really come together and turn into one thing. Maybe this episode would have been better if it were 22 minutes, but as it is, it's okay. It's a shame because they really wasted the good premise and jokes they were given, but unfortunately the concept just wasn't fully realized. Episode 16A, Fairy Fairy Quite Contrary. Remy Bucks Aplenty challenges Timmy to a fairy duel in hopes that Timmy loses Cosmo and Wanda. This episode is the first appearance of the characters Remy Bucks Aplenty and Wandissimo Magnifico, and they are good characters. I like the complexities they provide. At first glance, it might seem that Remy doesn't really need a fairy. He basically has as much money as could possibly exist, but his parents don't really care about him. And it doesn't matter how rich you are, nothing replaces human interaction. It makes sense for him to have a fairy just by necessity of having someone to talk to. And Wandissimo is also a fun character. He's the typical character who's obsessed with his looks, but honestly, I do think they do enough with it that it's not too cliched. Ditto on Remy, with the typical rich character archetype. And this plot does really seem to fit the characters in it. Timmy does seem to be a happier person overall with less money, but I'm glad they didn't just go down the road of using that moral. It's also nice to see a decent duel as well. A lot of the gags, such as the Donkey Kong parody and the clever solution of Cosmo turning into an exact clone of Wandissimo to distract him, really do show that this episode was written well. Overall, not many complaints. Good episode. Episode 16B, Nectar of the Odds. Timmy sells lemonade that Cosmo's socks have been dipped in to get tickets to see Crash Nebula on ice. While I don't remember many of the episodes from this season, this is one I definitely remember watching, along with A Mile in My Shoes. And I have to say, it does really hold up. There are a lot of funny jokes in the episode, such as Chechu Betcha becoming taller, the fishing joke, and Francis coming up from inside the toilet. The one joke I found myself scratching my head at was Vicky using slave labor for her lemonade stand. How can that be considered funny? But I digress. I really do like the episode. It's a classic story of money going way too far. Timmy has enough money for himself to get to the Crash Nebula on Ice show, but it's only because he pushes Cosmo too far. If I have one complaint about the episode, it's that it really isn't gradual. It just suddenly becomes a major plot point, but that's kind of splitting hairs when the episode is so funny. And not just funny, but clever. Timmy's lemonade is made with Cosmo's socks, which grant the wishes of people that drink the lemonade. And with people's wishes getting out of control, it's not worth having a lemonade stand. Although there's really no reason Timmy would have to get rid of the money he made when he unwishes everyone's wishes. They just threw that in so there'd be no way for him to get into Crash Nebula on Ice. But, minor problems aside, this episode is good. Episode 17A, Hail to the Chief. Timmy runs for class president but finds it's not all it's cracked up to be. This episode is really mundane, which isn't really helped by its pacing. We see Timmy upset at how current class presidents are running things, then he decides to run, and at first he likes it, then he decides he doesn't like it, tries to get impeached, and then he basically gets impeached as soon as he wants out. This episode is paced like a fever dream as a result. All the plot points I just mentioned are barely given any time to develop. I had a hard time really caring because it doesn't really feel like a story has been told when it's paced this poorly. There were some decently funny jokes, such as the presidential toilet, Cosmo's toilet joke in response to that, and some others. If I can give this episode props anywhere, it's that it mastered toilet-adjacent humor without going full-on gross out in the process, which is a very difficult tightrope to walk. I think had you stretched this episode out, cut all the Shakespeare stuff out, and actually let each plot point develop, you could have had a decent episode. But as it is, the jokes are only enough to keep it okay. Episode 17B, Twistory. Timmy talks to 3 of the actual founding fathers to help him with his history project. Fun fact, this episode had a controversy surrounding it that caused Nickelodeon not to air it in reruns for years. I'm not really going to be discussing it, and it won't affect the rating really because I barely consider it a controversy. It had more to do with Nickelodeon being scared of backlash that wasn't really there. If you want to know what the controversy was, look it up. As for the actual episode, I think it's incredibly historically inaccurate, which is something you might think I'd have more of a problem with, especially as a history major, but I really don't. A lot of the things were there for laughs. I'm more concerned with your mental state if you actually use this episode for historical information. Seriously, George Washington didn't have manic episodes every time he saw a tree or something made out of wood. And Benedict Arnold wasn't some stereotypical supervillain. And John Hancock wasn't that obsessed with signing his name on everything. If you take that seriously, there's no hope for you. But each of the caricatures of the founders adds its own charm to the episode. And it is kind of hilarious when you think about it. Time travel warps the past such that independence was never declared and everything suddenly turns British. That's just so weird I can't really help but take this episode seriously as little as possible. And honestly, I wish more Fairly OddParents had that quality to them. It gives them a certain charm, and for that reason, I consider this episode to be good. Although one problem I have is with the beginning scene in the talk show. I found that part to be uncharacteristically unfunny. I have no idea what was wrong, but that whole part of the episode was boring and didn't really hold my attention at all. But it wasn't bad enough or long enough to take away from the rating. Episode 18A, Fool's Day Out. Timmy summons the April Fool to get back at his friend. This episode kinda made me angry on a very simplistic level. We've seen Fairly OddParents botch morals before, and I have a feeling this won't be the last time we see it either. Because Timmy being held to a different standard than the rest of the cast tends to be a problem in a lot of the bad episodes this season. The only difference is, it's not the main focus of the episode. Timmy wants to prank his friends, as earlier in the episode it's established that he gets pranked a lot. And not just harmless pranks either. We see Timmy get attacked by a groundhog multiple times in the episode. So of course we'd want to see something similar to happen to Chester and AJ. So, when Timmy enlists the help of the April Fool to get Chester stuck to a spinning fan, and have AJ's History of Humanity report get burned, I don't feel too bad for them. But for some reason this is apparently wrong according to the episode. And what's worse is that Cosmo and Wanda, the people telling him that what he did was wrong, get another groundhog to attack him in the closing seconds of the episode. Needless to say, the humor doesn't live up to the quote I chose. And that isn't the only problem. The April Fool wants to destroy Earth for some reason. So Timmy wishes the entire atmosphere was replaced with laughing gas so everyone would laugh and the April Fool wouldn't be able to contain his joke and be blown back to Fairy World, which feels incredibly forced. It feels like it was pulled out of thin air, no pun intended. What's worse is that there's very little subtlety when this happens. Timmy just says, hey, we should do this, and then he does, and it goes exactly as planned, which is incredibly boring and anticlimactic. It's a bad episode. Episode 18B, Déjà Vu. Timmy gets a watch that can redo moments in time. So, because the next 2 episodes are pretty major, I won't spend much time on this one because there's not much to say about it. The only mildly amusing part of the episode was the bus driver's remark, although it was cheapened by the fact that it happened multiple times. This episode is really boring and couldn't hold my attention, just because of the amount of times things are redone. There's no real consistency to it. When you go back in time, it's not the exact same as it was, which makes the current time in this episode really hard to keep track of. And in the end, it's essentially the same as the beginning, except with Vicky in a full body cast. Other than that, I don't really feel much toward this episode, and not much was notable. It feels like there's not much really happening. It's essentially a 3-minute plot with snippets replayed to fill up 11 minutes. Okay, episode. Episode 19, Information Stupor Highway. Timmy travels into the internet to intercept an email his parents sent to Trixie Tang. My favorite part of the episode was the scene with Crocker in a dress, and not just because it's funny to see Crocker in a dress, but because back in high school, my AP statistics teacher got compared in terms of appearance to Mr. Crocker quite a bit. Not because he had ears on his neck, but because he had the same stature and wardrobe, glasses included. And all I can think about when I watched that scene for this review was the thought of him wearing a dress, which makes that part of the episode even more hilarious. Personal anecdotes aside though, this episode is really good. I really enjoy the creative concept and the imagination put into that concept. The visuals inside the internet are really cool even if the CGI is a bit dated by today's standards, and I think having Timmy inside the internet really makes this episode feel like an adventure, which, if you'll notice, is a common thing for me to say when I find episodes to be good. The humor is there as well. Veronica's obsession with Trixie, the battering ram running gag, the different computers Timmy visits, they're all great and really need to be seen. But if I pointed out every great joke in this episode, that would ruin them for you. And I think this is a plot worthy of taking up the 22-minute runtime. There's not really any filler, things are constantly happening, and this episode is a blast to watch. I really wish there were more episodes like this, and there is at least one I'll be talking about in a future season, but all you need know is that this is one of the classic episodes of The Fairly OddParents. Episode 20, Scary Godparents. Tired of not getting any candy, Timmy wishes for every Halloween costume to be realistic. As far as Halloween specials go, this one does a lot right. You have satire of Halloween itself, with the rich kids getting actual candy and even Timmy's video games. You have a deconstruction of those tropes with Timmy wishing everyone's costumes were real and scary, and to fill up the 22-minute runtime you have a side plot with Mark Chang. I really like the beginning setup for Timmy's wish. They actually took the time to develop the reason for Timmy wanting everything to be realistic. There's even a decent musical number thrown in as well. Timmy's wish essentially turns bad when he realizes it doesn't just apply to him and his friends, but everyone. And the Crash Nebula episode at the beginning foreshadowed the climax of the episode was also a nice touch. If I have one complaint, it's that the episode could stand to be a bit funnier, but honestly, I don't hold it against the episode too much. I think there were some decently funny jokes, but they weren't proportional to the length of the episode. I think the episode wasn't really trying to be too hilarious, and that the focus was on the story, so I can be a bit more forgiving there. And I think this is a good episode. It won't make very many top 5 lists, but it's an enjoyable watch. And that is every episode of The Fairly OddParents Season 2 reviewed. Let's take a look at some statistics. Judging by the pie chart, I'd say the ratings have more of an even split than I expected to see. I went into this review expecting a lot more good episodes, as I heard people hyping up this season quite a lot, and I am definitely disappointed by the number of okay and bad episodes this season. Comparing this to Season 1, the good episodes make up a smaller proportion of the episodes in Season 2. By percentage alone, Season 2 seems to be a step down from Season 1. I will concede that Season 2 reaches higher highs and lower lows, so the good episodes we got this season were actually better than Season 1, but that comes at the cost of quantity. In terms of which season is better, I'd have to go with Season 1. That season had only one bad episode that wasn't as bad as a lot of the bad episodes we got this season, and Season 2 had more good episodes in terms of percentage, albeit ones that weren't as good as Season 2. In terms of a rating for this season, I'm going to call this season okay, which I'm shocked to be doing considering the high regard a lot of people tend to have for this season. But I do think it's enough of a step down in quality from Season 1 to bump down the rating. Keep in mind that I don't hate this season, okay is just the middle ground. I may not hate this season, but I can't say I like it either. Now it's time for my bottom 5. At number 5, Foulballed. Number 4, Boy Toy. Number 3, Boys in the Band. At number 2, Superbike. And the worst episode of the season by a mile is the Switch Glitch. But now on to my top 5. At number 5, Fairy Fairy Quite Contrary. Number 4, Nectar of the Odds. At number 3, Mighty Mom and Dyno Dad. At number 2, action-packed. And number 1, the best episode of the season, is Information Stupor Highway. I cannot give that episode enough praise. It is, by miles, the best episode of the season. But that's about it for me. As always, thanks to Pie Guy Rules for the inspiration, and the Fairly Odd Parents Wiki for the information. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.